The Apostle Peter wrote in his first epistle, "The end of all things is at hand." Did he mean this for his time or our time? Let's talk about that. In our last segment, one of the things we noticed was how corrupt the generation of the first century had become. And this was after God gave them a second chance by allowing them to build a second temple. The second temple was a far cry from the first one in many ways, but it did allow them to continue the Levitical sacrificial form of worship. Now, Ezra was a very dedicated priest who was sent to Jerusalem to teach the people the law. The book of Nehemiah shows Ezra reading the law to the people every day in the city of Jerusalem after the completion of the building of the walls of the city. In the 9th and 10th chapters of the book of Nehemiah, we find the people gathered together, dressed in sackcloth, with dust on their heads, recounting all the sins of the past, and then strongly vowing in great detail to be faithful to the law of Moses. But even after the vows of faithfulness were made in Nehemiah chapter 10, it was not long before widespread disobedience was once again the law and the order of the day. But as regards the degrading of the priesthood, there is much more to tell. Before we continue what Peter had to say concerning the last days in the book of Acts, I would like you to take a look at one more thing that reiterates just how corrupt this priesthood had become during the last 300 years before Jesus came on the scene. Concerning the second temple, Jewish rabbi Ken Spiro said, "The intense spirituality of the first temple cannot be compared to the second. The constant open miracles are gone. Prophecy will also disappear during the early years of the second temple. The Ark of the Covenant is gone, and although there is a Holy of Holies, it stands empty." According to the Talmud, during the first temple period of about 400 years, there were only 18 high priests. During the second temple period of 420 years, there were more than 300 high priests. We know from the Talmud that Yochanan was the high priest for 80 years, Shimon was high priest for 40 years, and Yishmael ben Pabai was high priest for 10 years. Now listen to this next statement that he says. That means in the remaining 290 years there were at least 300 priests, one every year or so. What accounts for that? Spiro goes on to point out that the office of the high priest actually became up for sale and went to the highest bidder. This is a total violation of the law and certainly shows how corrupt the priesthood had become. All of this went on for a period of almost 300 years until our loving and patient God had had enough of it and finally called an end to it. Finally, in the Old Testament, in chapter 4 of the book of Malachi, the prophet warns them of the coming desolation of those who do not fear him. He follows this by telling them that God would send Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord. And we read in Malachi the 4th chapter, "Behold, I am sending you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of Jehovah. And he shall turn the hearts of the fathers to the sons, and the hearts of the sons to their fathers, that I not come and strike the earth with utter destruction." And we know that Jesus also told his disciples that this Elijah was actually John the Baptist when he said in Matthew the 11th chapter, "From the time of John the Baptist until now, violent people have been trying to take over the kingdom of heaven by force. And all the books of the prophets and the law of Moses told what was going to happen up to the time of John. And if you believe them, John is Elijah, the prophet you are waiting for." This is from the Contemporary English Version. Because they continued to shamelessly disobey, even to the point of crucifying the Son of God, this prophecy would result in the most severe of judgments. But now let's go back to Peter's discourse at Pentecost. I know we've discussed this before, but I want you to notice once again what Peter said in Acts the 2nd chapter. Peter stood with the 11 apostles and spoke in a loud and clear voice to the crowd, saying, "Friends and everyone else living in Jerusalem, listen carefully to what I have to say. You are wrong to think that these people are drunk. After all, it's only 9 o'clock in the morning. But this is what God had the prophet Joel say. When the last days come, I shall give my spirit to everyone. Your sons and daughters will prophesy, your young men will see visions, and your old men will dream dreams." Yes, we did discuss this passage at length in the last segment, but the thing I wanted you to notice here is that this prophecy of Joel of the last days was going to happen right there and then. He carries this theme over in the epistles, which he wrote as general letters to the persecuted Christians. But before we begin an examination of Peter's general epistles, let's look at a little background information which will actually come to bear on his motive for writing the epistles. Now we know it is generally agreed upon that Peter wrote this epistle to the persecuted Christians during the time frame just before or after the city of Rome burned. We also know that this was most likely just prior to Peter's martyrdom, thus dating his writing somewhere in the mid-60s, just a few years before the destruction of Jerusalem. Yes, Peter was speaking to those who were undergoing a very powerful wave of persecution at the hands of Nero. In order to deflect suspicion from him as having set the fire, he blamed the Christians, whom Nero considered to be nothing but a despicable sect of the Jews. He hated the Jews anyway, and the fact that they worshiped this man Jesus instead of him made him all the more furious. Fox's Book of Martyrs reports that Nero was so diabolic that he would skin animals and sew the skins onto the Christians, who thereafter, and I quote, were worried by dogs until they expired. Yes, this madman would also soak the shirts of the Christians in stiff wax and make them wear them as he set them on fire in the gardens, all for his enjoyment. Did it work? Did it cause the Christians to give up their faith? Quoting from Fox's Book of Martyrs, it says, "This persecution was general throughout the whole Roman Empire, but it rather increased than diminished the spirit of Christianity. In the course of it, St. Paul and St. Peter were martyred." So how did Peter's writings reflect all of this? What was he anticipating the near future to bring? And how would he encourage those struggling persecuted Christians to whom he wrote those epistles? Reading from J.P. Green's literal translation, we see that he immediately calls attention to the time in which they were living, early in the first chapter of his first epistle. Notice what it says. "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. He, according to his great mercy, having regenerated us to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, to an inheritance incorruptible and undefiled and unfading, having been kept in heaven for you, the ones in the power of God, being guarded through faith to a salvation ready to be revealed in the last time." The last phrase here in 1 Peter 1:5 is the Greek phrase kairo eschatos. The word eschatos in Greek is where we get our word eschatology, which is a study of the last days. The word kairo translates as occasion, opportunity, or time. Clearly then, from these words, Peter expected that they were on the verge of the end of something very important, and was encouraging them that they had a wonderful future beyond that. This is what strengthened them in the last times during this horrible persecution at the hands of Nero. Then later in the same chapter we read even more encouragement, where he says, "But with the precious blood of Christ, as a lamb without blemish and without spot, indeed having been foreknown before the foundation of the world, but revealed in the last times because of you." Again we see a form of the word eschatos, this time with the Greek word chronon. The Greek word chronon is where we get our word chronology. So 2 times in the first chapter we see an indication that Peter believed they were living in the last days, a time which would bring about the end of chronology. Do you get the drift here? Peter is speaking the end of the Jewish chronology. Already in chapter 1 of his epistle, we find him speaking of this. And notice who his audience was. As we have already stated, it was those Christians who were being heavily persecuted at that time. It was not a message to people thousands of years later. To reiterate this point, he says in the 4th chapter of his first epistle, "But the end of all things has drawn near. Be of sound mind then, and be sensible to prayers." In the Greek, this phrase reads, "Panton de ta telos engike," which means the end of all things has drawn near. The Greek word panton here is important because we see that it is a declension of the word pas, which means the whole or the all of it. Thus, by Peter telling them the end of all things had drawn near, he was telling them that the entire Old Covenant system of things, or the whole part of it, was about to end, and they were covered by their continued faith, which they should display with their works, including their prayers. Then later in the same chapter, Peter says, "Because the time has come to begin the judgment from the house of God, and if firstly from us, what will be the end of the ones disobeying the gospel of God?" Notice that he says this judgment is to begin with the house of God. This is the Greek phrase to oikou to theou, which means exactly what it says, the house of God. What was the house of God? Albert Barnes states of this in his commentary. Benson, Bloomfield, and many others suppose that this refers to the Jews and to the calamities that were to come around the temple and the holy city about to be destroyed. But the more obvious reference is to the Christians, spoken of as the house or family of God. There is probably in the language here an allusion to Ezekiel 9:6, which says, "Slay utterly old and young, both maids and little children and women, and begin at my sanctuary." Yes, this judgment would begin very soon, and not only would the temple of God be destroyed, but those early Christians would experience this strong wrath as a byproduct of what was going on there. Thus, he encouraged them to remain strong, and the record shows that the early church did just that, and it grew in the process as this intense persecution continued. All of this is reminiscent of what Jesus said in Luke 21 when he said, "For these are days of vengeance, when all things that have been written are to be fulfilled." Yes, that judgment completely consumed the house of God or the temple, and it was completely reduced to rubble, and it ended the Levitical system of sacrificial worship forever. But despite severe persecution, as we said earlier, the church continued to grow, watered by the precious blood of those saints. When we return in our next segment, we will look at perhaps the most famous passage that Peter uttered in his epistles, in 2 Peter the 3rd chapter, when he said, "But the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens will pass away with rushing sound, and having burned, the elements will be dissolved, and earth and the works in it will be burned up." Now you are probably saying to yourself, this has to be in our future. Well, the answer may surprise you. Won't you join us for this session? Thank you and have a great day.